Welcome to our panel discussion about the reception of Ukrainian refugees in European countries, and is organized by the Nordic Franco Funding. More than 6.3 million Ukrainians have fled to Europe, and approximately 3.7 million are internally displaced. The Temporary Protection Directive, introduced by EU in March 2022, granted Ukrainian refugees temporary rights to reception, medical care, work, and education across all EU member states, and it was also implemented in Norway. It has been extended until March 2026. And this directive exempted Ukrainians from the restrictive asylum procedures applied to other refugee groups. So Ukrainian refugees were granted group protection, thus they didn't have to provide individual claims of persecution. The reliance on temporary collective protection signals a broader shift in asylum policies, from permanent settlement to precarious time-limited legal status. What are the consequences of the temporary protection regimes, and how do current asylum policies and the shift towards temporary protection impact the well-being and labour market participation of Ukrainian refugees? And what are the lessons learned from this new way of receiving refugees in Europe? With me to discuss these and other questions today, I have Are Knudsen, who is a research professor at the Christian Michelsen Institute. And Are specializes in forced displacement, camp-based and urban refugees in the Middle East, particularly Lebanon. And his research focuses on emergency urbanism and shelter architectures in camps and informal areas. But the reason Are is with us here today is because Are has been a research professor in the Influx project supported by Norforsk, which focuses on the governance and integration of refugees and other migrants who left due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this project examines how these migrants are received, settled, and integrated in the Nordic and Baltic host countries. I also have Lena Nere with me, and Lena is a professor at the Department of Sociology, University of Helsinki. Lena has written extensively on themes such as migration, asylum, transnationalism, aging, care work, and precarity. And she's currently leading the research project Tackling Precarious and Informal Work in the Nordic Countries, funded by Future Challenges in the Nordics program, and the research project Caring Labour, a multimodal study of migrant workers' care practices and mobilities, funded by Kone Foundation. And her work on Ukrainian refugees that we will hear today is research done in the Horizon project, Improving the Living and Labour Conditions of Irregularized Migrant Households in Europe, I claim, which is funded by European Commission. And finally, I'm very happy to have Camille Schmoll with me. She is the Director of Studies at the EHESS, École des Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and her work focuses on migration in the Mediterranean region. And she's a geographer, developing a spatialized view of migration processes, paying attention to the territorial and embodied dimensions of trajectories and the articulation of different places, type of places that constitute the migratory space. And in recent years, she has also developed a focus on migration of women to Europe and having a feminist perspective on migration. She's currently part of the project Everyday Exile, Gendered Trajectories, Family Recompositions, and the Settlement Process of Ukrainians in France, which is funded by the Research Foundation of the Red Cross in France. All right, so yes, and unfortunately, Marie-Laure Mallet-Garcia, Associate Professor at the University of Sorbonne Nouvelle University, was unfortunately prevented from joining us here in Bergen. I'm Synnøve Bendiksen. I'm a professor in social anthropology, and I've done research for a long time on irregular migration. So let's move over to the topic. So the EU's introduction of temporary protection visa for Ukrainians is unprecedented. And in Norway, since February 2022, 92,000 Ukrainian refugees has arrived in Norway. In Norway, this move to temporary protection meant that the asylum system was responding quickly in receiving and settling the asylum seekers from Ukraine. avoiding the long waiting periods typical for asylum decisions, what has often been called by researchers as temporary injustice. However, this swiftness also caused some new, perhaps surprising challenges. And Ara, you have done interviews with Ukrainian refugees, with staff and managers in 3 Norwegian arrival and reception centers, asylum reception centers. What consequences of this very swift process did you find in your research?
Okay, thank you, Cinema. I think the short answer to this is that Norway has approached the huge number of asylum seekers to Ukraine as a logistical challenge. And this has consequences both for the asylum seekers themselves, for the staff at the asylum centers, and also for the kind of facilities that we use to sort of receive asylum seekers, what you could call arrival infrastructures. And leaving my notes behind, I should try to explain how this might work. So as Cinema said, my background is not in Ukraine study. I'm a refugee scholar, most of my work in Middle East. But through this project called the Influx Project, which looked at the so-called influx of mainly Ukrainian asylum seekers to Nordic countries and some Baltic countries, I had a chance to do a kind of research I normally don't. And with my interest in emergency urbanism, housing for refugees, I thought it would be an opportunity to visit an asylum center, which I have never done. And I also knew some of the literature on asylum centers, which some of you would know is usually quite negative. It's quite sort of focused on the difficulties of living in asylum centers, the lack of privacy and so on, the mental issues. So this meant that I decided to look at 3 sort of facilities in Norway, beginning with the biggest one located outside Oslo, called the National Arrival Center. The National Arrival Center is where every asylum seekers, at least now, have to come if they come to Norway. At some point, they could register in Bergen, elsewhere, but now this is where you start your kind of asylum journey. This is a huge, even a little bit intimidating facility. 10,000 square meter, located sort of desolate, outside of desolate roundabouts, 1 hour's drive south of Oslo. It has a background. It was originally an industrial building, kind of and even a smart club. And it was then refurbished. And in 2015-16, it was used in the latter part of what we call the Mediterranean refugee crisis, when it still had Syrians coming to Norway. But by 2016, there was in this huge facility, it was only 6-7 people living or waiting as asylum seekers. Then everything changed. Then in 2022, 21-22, the asylum, the Ukraine crisis and war started, and suddenly we had upwards towards 1,000 asylum seekers per week coming to Norway. So the important thing about this facility is then, of course, this is where everyone starts their asylum journey. And the new thing about it, apart from its size, is, of course, that all the units, all the agencies needed to decide on an asylum application or an asylum to process, if you want, an asylum seeker, must be at this very location. So it means that the police unit is there, IMDi, UDI, they have long Norwegian names, I skip them now. All the agencies that deal with asylum applications and settlement are located at this facility. As you know, the facility is big. The refugee or the asylum seekers live in bunk beds, in green marquees, or kind of tents on the ground floor, and then the staff in one of the upper echelons in the upper part of the building. There are even also stacked containers, which was used to quarantine people, and for a while also used by Ukrainians who brought pets into Norway. They could even have pets, which is long discontinued. So in this unit, everything is in place to process an application quickly. What they do is they talk with the police for an asylum interview. They do self-registration. ID checks are important. And then, of course, they have to do a health check, which there is a dedicated health unit with a tuberculosis test. So in a very short time, you finish these three things. You finish ID registration, which is quite simple for Ukrainians because they usually have passports, valid ID. The asylum interview is necessarily very short because they, being from Ukraine, most of them are more or less already qualified for asylum, with a few exceptions. And then they are just waiting for a negative tuberculosis test. So it means that actually within as short as 3 days, they might finish all their sort of necessary sort of paperwork in this facility and is ready to go on to the next sort of next step of their asylum journey. When I talked to people there's an enormous focus on logistics, because with so many people coming, if you have 100 people in, you need 100 people out. So every night, the leader who sort of have, of course, there's the woman in charge of the running of the facility, not the legal side, but having food, meals, everything. She has to report how many are we now in the waiting zone, how many will be exiting tomorrow. So what came out of these interviews was very much focused on logistics. She said it's like assembling a car. Everything has to happen on time. And of course, this goes very quickly. The maximum time you can stay in this facility is 3 weeks. But generally, people stay as short as 3, 4, 5, 6 days. And then they're moved to asylum reception centers. And I'll try to be a little bit brief on that. So in the asylum reception centers, like the two I visited on the West Coast, one in Bergen and one on Stord, south of Bergen, they come there then after a very short stay at the National Arrival Center. They are shipped there, they are bused there. And on average, they only stay there in 2024, they only stay at the Asylum Reception Center for 54 days. If you compare that with what used to be the case, 400 days, maybe even 600 days we have if we go back a few years, people waiting much, much longer. It means that their stay is very short. But the regulations, sort of, the modules they have to complete, the training modules, the information packages, it could be things about living in Norway, gender-based violence. There's a huge number of modules that they have to go through at the center, at the Asylum Reception Center, which is the same type of modules that you will have to go through if you stay there for a year, which would be normal. So this puts a big stress on the staff. And there is also another bigger health test, which means that some of this is with using, of course, computer system, but some is also by paper. So this again, like this woman said, this is crazy sort of stress on the paperwork. And they said, these procedures have been sort of put on speed for the asylum seekers. So we see them first a very short stay at the arrival center, and coming to the reception centers. There's again stress mostly on the staff, because the asylum seekers, when you talk to them, they are quite happy. Which is sort of fully turns around all the literature on asylum centers, which tend to, and rightly so, focus on the stress of living there for 500-600 days. You don't know if your asylum application is going to be approved, so you can be forced to leave the country. But of course, the asylum seekers from Ukraine, they are quite sure that they will be, given they'll be allowed to stay in Norway. They're just waiting for the next level, which will be the municipalities, which will be for another time. So what comes out for me at these interviews is very strong focus on logistics. And there's an interesting researcher, Lorenzo Vianelli, written about what he calls logistification of arrival. And this is what I think we see here. It's kind of logistical chains where everything is supposed to be sort of smoothly, step by step, without any delays. And this has been implemented in Sweden many years ago. They call it sort of shorter wait, or kortare väntan in Swedish. So it seems to be this is, at least for the big, like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, this focus on speed, logistics, is now very much part of how we organize the arrival of asylum seekers. Both the computer systems used to affect it, the co-location of many sort of agencies at the same place, centralization, Yeah. But then I finished.
Yeah.
The paradox then that, of course, the asylum seekers are happy. They feel that they are treated very well. They are welcome and all that. So it's turns in a way the traditional discussion on asylum centers on its head.
Yeah, but does it? That's really super interesting, and it shows this different temporality focus where it's really talking about the swiftness and where the uncertainty is not present for them. But does it affect? And you talked a little bit about how the staff was impacted by it, but does it impact? And you said they were happy, but does it also come with some challenges for the refugees? This swiftness through the logistification of the process.
That may be something we have to see, because some of the research on asylum centers that focus on this long-term stay, it shows that there can be benefits of staying a long time in an asylum reception center. You learn cultural scripts, you learn language more, you're maybe better prepared in some way, despite the hardships of staying in an asylum center. You might be better prepared for life afterwards. So maybe that's even a research question in itself. Because if you go to the municipalities after finishing asylum reception centers, they move to municipalities. And there again, there's again a focus on speed. If there are not enough spaces, some cities have instituted sort of container homes. So we don't really know this question yet, I think. I don't doesn't mean that they don't come there with trauma.
Yeah.
The people I met, which was mostly young, actually not more by accident than by design. They were quite upbeat about coming to Norway. They had done asylum scoping before coming to Norway. They had gone on the internet to see, which country could, would be the easiest, so giving most support. And many of them have, I'll keep this very short, many of them have been around different countries before deciding that they couldn't make it, and they looked where could I seek asylum and have a chance of making it. Norway stood out. And that was part of the reason they came to Norway. But it doesn't mean that they are necessarily happy by the situation, but most of this group is young, educated, skilled. There were also couples, and they were sort of quite upbeat about their prospects for coming to Norway and getting employed and integrating. But then the question is, this is temporary.
Yeah, exactly. And Lena, you have done research on people who are employed and who have, you could say, going after the moment after the reception center, and how is this temporary protection regime also affecting?
Yeah, I mean, I have a question actually, because I don't think, are they asylum seekers in Norway? They are not seeking asylum. They are temporary protection beneficiaries. So I think it's important, because this is important to keep that distinction, because the whole point about the temporary protection is that you don't have to prove individual reason for being persecuted by your state. And I think that's also the issue with in a way, the benefit of the temporary protection is that you have this swiftness that you don't have to go through the asylum process. But then on the other hand, there is this that it's been extended always a year in advance. So actually many of the Ukrainians who have arrived to Finland would have applied to asylum, something a little bit more permanent, if that would have been possible. But it's not, because they are not persecuted by their own state. They have the possibility to return and so on. So that's not possible. So actually many have then opted to apply for more permanent residence permits, so based on labor, for instance. And in Finland, at least, it's the only kind of permit category where you can have two permits at the same time. You can be a temporary protection beneficiary, and also apply for another permit that gives you a little bit of that extra time to think about your life. But then labor-based permit comes with all sorts of other problems. You're tied to a certain labor sector. You're often tied to that you need to, if you want to change your work sector, you have to apply for another type of permit. But the fact that you are free to work from day one, and you are free to healthcare from day one, you're free to go back to your own country from day one, unless you're a man. So of course this applies to women, mostly if you're man who might be, then you might have issues of coming back, because of course you have to have a good reason for leaving Ukraine as a man, and so on. So there's this very strong, of course, gendered aspect of this protection regime in the first place, due to, of course, Ukraine being war and having imposed restrictions to men leaving of certain age. So there is freedom also to move in the labor markets, to look for better opportunities in a completely different way than would be in other types of as a non-EU migrant. So a little bit it would be comparable to arriving as a family through family reunification in a way that would be in the Finnish case. But what I want to highlight in terms of, but this temporariness, of course, poses its deep ontological insecurity, in the sense that, especially if you come from regions which have been destroyed, you don't have or are under occupation, you have no, because people obviously live in constantly following what is happening in Ukraine, and you might not know what will happen in potential in the peace negotiations, whether the region where, because a lot of people who came to Finland come from the occupied territories from east, and so you don't know if you have any place to return to. So what would be so all these kind of really big questions. So you might not have your home, might not, might be destroyed, etc., etc. All of these questions of that war, of course, impacts and affects one's everyday lives. So that there's this great uncertainty there embedded in this temporary protection regime. And the other thing that I think is important at the same time to highlight, and maybe this is something that we touch upon later on, is of course the fact that there was no crisis. So I was a little bit like you talked about Ukrainian crisis, but in Finland there hasn't been any crisis regarding to the reception of Ukrainians. So compared to what 2015, 2016, when 35,000 mainly Iraqis, but asylum seekers from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria came. Huge crisis, huge logistical crisis. We also built these arrival centers, etc. Huge reception crisis, huge crisis of potential criminality, etc. A whole kind, it seemed like, and there was no zero discussion of crisis. And 72,000 Ukrainian registered Ukrainian temporary protection beneficiaries in Finland, and there's zero crisis discourse. And this has also impacted the fact that there's been a flexibility when it comes to receiving Ukrainian refugees, in the sense that a lot of them have actually been privately, housed in accommodation, so we don't have this very centralized reception. They have moved from maybe reception centers to private accommodations or finding their own flats, etc. So there's been a very dispersed and very kind of non-issue, like a very, there hasn't been kind of these, although of course if you go and look into the everyday experiences, issues with reception center facilities, yes, but has been this kind of general acceptance and general kind of solidarity, mobilization of the civil society as well. And I'm going to finish here, just the fact that also Finland had a long history of our Ukrainians were coming to Finland as seasonal workers, have been coming for several years. So there were lots of existing, also the Ukrainian networks, and the Ukrainian community has been very important. So that has also kind of taken care of this. So there's been lots of this arrival and providing these infrastructures. So So it's interesting how kind of similar and different, or maybe from our different perspectives and so on. But
I think I just need to correct myself a bit. Of course, you are right. When I talked about crisis, I thought about the Mediterranean refugee crisis, the Syrians, not the Ukrainians have been well received, of course.
Yeah.
And like you said, at the beginning, they could have private accommodation, and they did. It's only very lately that they are now restricted, that you have to, that you cannot now go and live in a family and take direct contact with the municipality. But you could. So there has been no crisis in that sense, but it has been kind of tightening of regulations, but we'll come back to that.
But I think, I mean, it's important to highlight the fact that it has not been defined as a crisis, and the racialization of asylum seekers that we see through exactly the lack of crisis definition in the media. I wanted to move over to you, Camille, because in France was actually one of the countries where the fewest Ukrainian refugees have arrived. And can you try to explain to us why is that so?
That tells about the limits, of political goodwill, because actually the system for welcoming Ukrainian refugees in France was really smooth and effective. And everything was very well organized. So what we did, I have to tell a few words about our research project. Actually, I worked with 3 other scholars, 2 Ukrainian scholars that were welcomed in my research center after February 2022, and 1 French sociologist. And we first worked in the one big reception center that was set up. It was not a reception center, actually, it was a hub that was set up in Paris in a building that is usually used for the international fairs. And it was a huge one used to organize and resettle Ukrainian people everywhere in France. And so the first weeks and months, we did some observations there. And then we moved to a rural area where some of the persons we met also there were resettled in northwestern France, so in Normandy. And then we continued, and we still continued the fieldwork there. And what was really interesting in this hub, so it's called Porte de Versailles, it's in the southwest of Paris, this international fair hub, which was open for the Ukrainian people, is that everything was very smoothly organized. They could access health services, and also they could ask for the health permit, allowing them to access all the health facilities. They could ask for the temporary protection, of course, so the resident permit as a temporary protection, a beneficiary of temporary protection. They could access also to employment offices, so that they could still start to look for employment. They could also say where they wanted to be resettled, and they could even stay and sleep and be resettled in another country in Europe. So some of them were in transit on their way to Southern Europe, mostly Portugal and Spain, actually. And so they would just stop for a couple of nights in the reception hub and then go. There were some buses taking them to Portugal or Spain. So it was incredibly smooth and easy. And at the same time, that's the paradox, because compared to what happened in 2015 in France, it was completely different. I mean, what we found is that actually there was also a very strong willing from the civil society to engage in welcoming people. So many people would propose to take an Ukrainian family at home. And actually it was the same in 2015, but the difference was that the state was there, and the state encouraged these people to welcome and everything, which was a big difference with 2015. And so the Ministry of Interior would put on a platform in which you could just put your ad and say, I have a room for 4 people. And actually the issue was with pets, because many people were not ready to welcome pets. And there were many pets, like in this hub. There were it was unbelievable, like cats, dogs. I met a woman, she was with her mother, a young woman. She was with her mother and 7 dogs. And so there was difficulties in finding a family for 7 dogs, actually. But usually it was very smooth and effective. But at the same time, nobody wanted to, very few people wanted to stay in France. And this is really interesting because we saw there is a selection which is connected to the image people may have of France. So, for instance, those who wanted to stay in France, many often they were in Ukraine, they were like architects or studying like fashion or this kind of. And so they had this image a bit like imaginaries of Paris and France being so, fashion and so on. It was really interesting. But most of them didn't want to stay because, of course, because of social networks. So what is really interesting is that when you give people the freedom to choose their destination, which is exactly, of course, the opposite of the usual asylum system in which you will be like limited due to the Dublin regulation. You will not be able to choose your country of reception. People will like choose where they have communities. And so since France was not a very important place for Ukrainian migrants, they will not stay. So most of them didn't stay. And when they stayed, it was really for specific reasons. It's kind of, like in love with France for specific connections connected to professional niche. And also, then, and maybe I will tell a little bit more afterwards, the situation in which now we are doing our ethnographic research, which is which had a particular connection because in the area in which we are doing this research, there were several people having connections with Ukraine. So one local stakeholder, like an important political figure, he was married with an Ukrainian woman, or this kind of connection networks. Another one is that a woman from the region, she was living as an expatriate in Ukraine, so she had to come back also in February 2022, and she took back with her, she was a French professor in Ukraine, so she took back with her several of her school students. So it was very specific situations and connections with France, but usually people would not stay. We don't have any interest. And I think now France is the last country in terms of the number of Ukrainian refugees in Europe. I think it's the last one. Though there are still like 70,000 people.
And most of those are staying in the rural context, right?
Yeah.
Which creates particular challenges, I suppose, because the rural can be rather isolating, even in France. Can you tell a little bit about the rural context?
So the research we are doing now is in a group of villages in northwestern, so between Normandy and the northern part of France. And it's not only rural, it's deprived, like economically and demographically area. So it's quite poor. No, there are not many jobs. It's a little bit touristy, so a small amount of jobs in the tourism area, but it's not that attractive in terms of employment. And so it's been really interesting to study in this area because on the one hand, because it was a very small setting, with people knowing each other, willing to welcome, having connections with Ukraine. There was also a whole network of former professors of Russian who wanted really to welcome Ukrainian people. Like there were also a couple of Russian exilees that wanted to welcome Ukrainian people. So this happened in a very short time that people got to know from Ukraine, actually, being connected somehow with the region, that there was a good context for welcoming. So at the beginning, it was incredible. Like it was because you had this possibility of informality, people knowing each other, hosting people, helping them with the schools. For instance, the children who go to school will be helped. And also a network of welcoming municipalities in this area that organized, just as in, we have researched, it had been researched a lot in 2015 like this, welcoming refugee place. And so you had this network of places from very different political options, from the left to the right, who decided to really warmly welcome. And so at the beginning, it was really, really positive. And people tell you it was like a family and it was so nice and they give me everything. People would be so generous and so well organized, due also to the state that was really like helping also people to be nice, because, you know, they gave some help. And of course, the fact that they had access to temporary protection helped a lot. And then things became to start to be a little bit more difficult when trying to look for a job. There is a huge issue of the skilling, because people are very well skilled, actually. Those people that came, as for Lena, most of them come from the eastern part or from Kiev. And so they can't, some of them can go back, but it's been difficult, at least at the beginning, to go back and forth at the beginning. Now it's a bit different. And so they looked for a job, but of course there is the issue of language that is huge. I mean, they don't have any idea of French, and there are no language courses. In France, it's really difficult. Actually, there were some, but due to the remoteness of the place, it was really difficult to access. So they had been confronted with all the problems of also the French people have in living in a rural, very remote area. You don't have access to health services. If you don't have a car, you cannot move to the language courses. One of the young women I've been following in the last months, she studies at the University of Rouen. So she has to take 2 buses, and it takes her 4 hours a day to commute to go to study at the university, which is she's been helped a lot by the local people to go to register and so on, but still it's really a lot of efforts to go and study. So yes, at the beginning, being in a small setting has been something very positive, and now remoteness start to be a huge problem.
Yeah, also in terms of the temporary protection, which has to be renewed every 6 months,
Definitely.
I believe, in France.
Definitely. And then the temporary protection doesn't give you access to, for instance, to a driving license. This is a big issue, because in France, I don't know if it's the EU regulation or if it's French, but you have to live at least for 6 months to pass the driving license. So with the temporary protection, you cannot, and this is in remote areas, it's a huge issue, because so those who had already the driving license in Ukraine, they will help the others, so they will give a lift to the others to go to the language courses and so on. So they will organize. It's kind of informal way to help each other, but it's not, of course, on the long run, it's a problem. But otherwise, you have no access to a driving license. So some women went back to Ukraine to get their driving license in Ukraine. And so this is the advantage of the ability to go back and forth, you know.
Yeah.
You go and you take your driving license and then you come back. Maybe you also buy a car. Yeah. And another problem with the temporary protection is that you cannot be self-employed. So you have to, so this is an issue, because some of them started to set up some small businesses like selling cars or or bringing stuff from Ukraine and so on. And you cannot do this regularly, which is a big issue also.
Yeah.
No.
So it also shows how the temporary protection affects the kind of work that you could have. And I know that also affects the situation in Finland, where you have a rural situation, but rather different than how the rural plays out in France.
Yeah, I mean, in Finland, I don't think we have this self-employed like restriction, but the temporary protection only counts half of the time that you stay in the country. So if you have a long-term, for instance, to get a permanent residence, if you have a long-term plan to live and settle in Finland, it kind of the 3 years or that you have stayed only counts for 1.5 years, which also is like quite a kind of arbitrary temporal border that has been established. So in this way, many people actually then want to apply for the labor-based permit or permit as a self-employed or some other permit type in order to be fully recognized and living in the country. But yeah, also in the iClaim project, so we were looking at Ukrainians in agro-food sector and in domestic and cleaning sector, and also these questions of being isolated and being working in also in agricultural food production, mostly in strawberry farming, but also open air farming, very labor intensive, but also a lot of it is seasonal work. And then some had even the strategy that they continued going back and forth. So after the season was over, you would go back to Ukraine, but others then found other jobs for when the season of strawberry picking was over. But then others then found jobs in greenhouses or other farming, and this is of course, Ukraine is very agricultural country. There's a lot of big agricultural agro-food production, so it's not strange that a lot of the people had already had experiences already working in Finland in the agro-food production. But many were very skilled as well, and had in Ukraine, many were had degrees in agronomy, for instance. And what they found was a different kind of de-skilling, that their knowledge and skills were not, were not recognized in terms of pay, but not also recognized in terms of potential professional attitude, or that you could actually have something to say to the farmer of how things should be. So we have a lot of cases and interviews of people being mostly felt kind of that the discrimination and all of that was in a way, and the hard work was somehow easy to take, but the fact that your knowledge and your kind of agency and your ideas and your skills were in no way recognized was kind of degrading. But here, thanks to the fact that they had temporary protection, they were able to, so we saw a lot of social networks being then operational, used to find new jobs, and people going and moving around in Finland in the sectors and looking, so not sticking into that one area, but moving around and trying to find the places where they could get more recognition also for their skills. But it was interesting how you were saying about these areas being deprived, and they are deprived for the Finns. And so the question is, why would migrants want to kind of live there, and how would they somehow, because you have also this discourse that we will revitalize the rural countryside by moving and having migrants living there. But why would they want to live there? There's no services, there's only the hard work, the low paid jobs available. So a lot of similar questions and hardship of and especially for kids and getting the education and studies. So some had the strategy that the older kids then went back to Ukraine to study, because there's difficult language barriers, difficult to get access to the university. So
thank you. Yeah, temporary protection. I remember that. Yeah. But what I find interesting is that, of course, Ukrainians were very much welcome to Norway. But coming into end of sort of 2023, the numbers kept increasing, and Norway accepted many more than had many, so 3 times I think as many as Finland. And Denmark or Sweden, I don't remember but at least a lot more. So the concern grew in Norway that we are accepting too many. And then the Norwegian sort of policies changed sort of 180 degrees. So there was an attempt to reduce, the arrivals of Ukrainians. And of course, the thinking was that, it's because of the benefits, because of the much greater benefits that Norwegians give, or Norway provides. And then started the process from end of 2023, but sort of consecutively sort of reducing language modules, training, and of course benefits in monetary benefits, taking by child benefits, for example, taking longer time to be allowed to have them. Also, not allowing families or individuals to go back to Ukraine. So Norway really changed its approach from end of 2023, early 24, with the idea of sort of harmonizing our policies with those of Finland and maybe especially Sweden. And also interesting that Sweden, of course, I'll not go into details, maybe I don't even remember them, but Sweden had a much more sort of limited support for Ukrainians than Norway. And they had a quite high employment rate. But Norway, I think in 2022, it was down to 2%, and it has continued to climb. And I think I checked the numbers today. Now it's like 35% of the Ukrainians between something 22 and 60 something are employed. So it has gone over from 1 year. I think mid last year, it was like 23%. It's now at 35%, which is quite high. So it's the focus in Norway now, of course, is very much on sort of getting people employed, and of course then to come into the other question we haven't still discussed is the question of why should you get employed and integrate when you are not allowed to stay, maybe. And this is, of course, as I said, I was really struck when I met these young couples. They were sort of starry-eyed. Some were planning to do their studies in Trondheim, they hoped. Some were skilled workers, wanted to work, maybe a crane operator, and his wife, a yoga teacher. They really see that kind of future in Norway. And some of them had been on a diet of Viking sagas and fictional films. And they were sort of very taken by Norway. Even some thought that Norway was safer than Sweden, where at that time, we had this gang-related violence in Sweden. And they think Norway was safer. And I'll say, I'll finish soon. They also had, like I mentioned last intervention, done this kind of asylum scoping, which I thought was quite interesting. They had traveled around Europe, but not sought asylum. And moving with friends, they're gonna left as couples, then split, then rejoined, and then stay in Ireland, even if far away in Canada and the Dominican Republic. I say, we are not making it. We need some more support. Where can we find the support? They go on the internet, and Norway stood out. So you can say to some degree, this Norwegian authorities' idea that the benefits package attracts Ukrainians in Norway is in a way correct, since more are choosing Norway than Sweden and Denmark. But there's been some kind of not even a paradigm shift, but I think I've called it something like the procedural shift then in Norway, that Norway is sort of slowly, progressively reducing benefits because, of course, they want to keep, I think, the costs down, first of all.
And one of the limitations that they have included is that they're not allowed to, Ukrainians are not allowed to return to Ukraine, even for short period of times, which was implemented in 2023, November, December. Whereas I know that that's in France and Finland, that's not the case. And Camille, in your research, you found that indeed this transnational connections has a huge important effect in the Ukrainian refugee lives. Maybe you can talk about that.
It has very strong effects. On the one hand, many of the Ukrainians we met went back to Ukraine to take care of the elderly or to take care of the husbands and so on. So they come back very often, as pets also. And some of them came back and brought back with them parents. And it's really interesting in terms of family reconfigurations, because it's not only a question of how the war has affected the life of couples, like, with men being stuck there and women going abroad, but it's also about parents, whether you choose or not to bring your parents with you, whether you choose to bring your children and so on. So it's a lot of rearrangements, and how do you organize with distance? How do you keep the family structure somehow, and how you change the family structure? Like, for instance, I have this example of this woman who is 60 years old. She's from Zaporizhia, and she started, so she was quite important civil servant in Zaporizhia. She had a whole career, and so she came to Normandy, and first she came back to France with she brought to France her nephew and a cousin, and the son of her nephew, and then she brought her sister, and then she brought a friend. And so now they are a kind of new family, living together there. And so it's changed everything in the way you think about family. And at the same time, some families also split. And I have some cases of women that decided to go back to Kiev. And so because they really couldn't deal with the de-skilling situation, it was too much. They couldn't find anything, any opportunities. They had teenagers who didn't want to stay because they were suffering from not being with their friends, and also some young men that wanted to engage with the war, and didn't wanted to bear, the responsibility. They felt like guilty of being abroad, so they just wanted to go back. And so they left their husband in France, because some of the husbands left at the beginning, but then they left back their husbands and came back to Ukraine. So you have so many different family configurations. And what is really striking for me, not only about I was mentioning before the driving license, but the issue of health, of welfare, transnational welfare circuits is really interesting, because the French public system, I thought the French, at least until a few years ago, let's say, the French health system, one of the best in the world. At least I thought so. But the Ukrainians are really disappointed with the French system. First, because they live in rural areas, and so it's a bit isolated, and it's not that easy to have an appointment at the hospital and so on. And then also because I think that maybe in terms of price, and the fact also that there is a private system in Ukraine that basically, if you pay, you can access now. I mean, which is not the case in France. I mean, you pay or you don't pay, you will. It will not be that easy. So many of them go back to Ukraine actually to have surgeries, to go to the doctor, to take care of their teeth and so on. And then, so they move back and forth also for issues of welfare and health benefit, which is quite interesting, because one of the main arguments now, the far right is very popular in France, and you have this idea that immigrants, they come to France to like, because we have too many benefits, and especially in terms of health, there's a huge debate, political debate in France around health benefits, and and the Ukrainian like that. No, we go back to Ukraine, to benefit our own care services, because France is not efficient enough. So it was quite interesting.
Yeah. Before leaving the word to you, Lena, about the rural or going back and forth process, I want to open up the floor if you have any questions or comments. Okay, we'll do that first then. Yeah, let's see.
So my question is regards class along the 4 countries. There's a lot of talk about high-skilled migrants moving, and I wonder if at all there's been an investigation on the extent to which class also intersects with issues of gender, age, to determine the kind of Ukrainian refugees that made it to these particular countries. Like, is this something you've found to be categorization that matters?
Well, I think that in Finland there is definitely these class divisions, of course, in the sense that many of those who work in the rural, in the agro-food production are from working class background, like mixed. We have those who have the university studies in agronomy, or lectures in agronomy, but then maybe most of the people have kind of working class backgrounds. But then in we also have this individual, like what Camille was saying, these individual cases of researchers at risk. Our university has organized students. So there's of course a lot of these social networks that have moved people for different kind of for different sectors and also from kind of with different skill sets. I mean, I think that artists, researchers, students. I mean, there's been all sorts of programs for various groups, and I think in the beginning of the war, and I think some Finns still do that they actually, but there was a big issue of actually Finns going with their vans and just going to Poland to the border and pick people up randomly. And quite a lot of these people have also stayed abroad, exactly like the social networks. There's a colleague who have been studying this very private, very kind of initiatives that happened in the spring of 22. So I think that the picture of the Ukrainian, I mean, how the Ukrainian community, because there was a big community in Finland already, is very mixed. I mean, I think it's kind of it's very gendered, mostly women, but in terms of class, it's very mixed, I would say.
Yeah, just very brief. I can't answer the class question, but they talk about since last year, I think at least about the third wave in Norway. But many of those are coming now. They are sick and old and needing treatment. So it's like the young, maybe agile came first, and then now it seems like the parents, families already settled here. So it's really a mix of people, and also in the beginning there were very few men, of course, because of men are not allowed to leave necessarily. Although some are leaving, I met some who had left. They usually go detours. They don't go the traditional border crossing. They go over the Carpathians, come some other way. But anyway, there seems to be this new third wave. That's why also then when they come to, let's say, this arrival center, which I mentioned, where they have now a lot more to do because many of them need referrals outside this facility. They have really, health problems. And I also saw the same when I visited this Magic Hotel, which was refurbished or reassigned as an asylum center in Bergen. So yeah, it seems to be a mix, and more men are now coming. I should know why, but I'm not sure.
Camille, do you want to add something in France?
Yes, I just wanted to mention, of course, there is this issue of class, and I would be really curious to see whether, for instance, it's mixed, but it's true that the people I've been meeting are quite skilled, but I'm not able to generalize as for now, so I don't know really what is the situation in France. But I wanted to mention, of course, there is the issue of class, the issue of gender, but also of age. And in France also many grandparents, grandmother arrived in the last months, and some of them being sick also. And of course, for these women, the situation is very particular because they will not be able to integrate in a way like, learning French when you are like 80 years old. I mean, it's not possible. So it's really somehow also sad, like, you understand that they feel like they're okay, they will die in France probably, and that's it. So the way also you see your own situation is really conditioned by also, of course, the generation, the age. And for these women, what has been really important is to participate to community life. So they will participate, for instance, to the associations or this kind of events, public events since it's small cities, they would know each other, the other old women of the area and so on, and it would be really important for them. But it's there is no vision of the future. I mean, you are already quite old and sick somehow, and you don't feel like you will be able to come back.
We have time for one more question, and then we have to. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm working for one of the welfare institution here in Bergen. So we have established a new group just to help the Ukraine through Norway's labor market. Yeah. So this group is established since December 2023. So it is important. It is interesting when you said that the number of unemployed is about 35 or something, right? So have you tried to find out, is it about that they don't want to, or it is a work, but they cannot work? So it's two different things. I think we need to go deep in the case, because in the project we did, some of them, they don't want to work, or they just use the lack of language as a reason, and then the type of work that they don't want to do it. Yeah. So we can just discuss about it later. And the specific difficulties also that not all the Ukrainians speak English. Yeah. So it's an obstacle also for us to help them through the Norwegian labor market. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, very interesting. It has been, some have speculated that because the benefits are so big, then there was not so much incentive to get employed. But again, if someone criticized the Swedish model, which was very limited, but it also means that they have to find employment to survive, and then they go into this very low-skilled, low-paid, maybe also rural flute picking, whatever, which you don't want anyway. You don't want to create a new underclass. So what this has been used, this Norwegian model in a way, to have quite generous benefits in the start, means that you get sort of a delay in employment. So in Sweden, you will have sort of quite rapid, like it was even 56%, I think, because they have no choice. They have to work. There's no benefits of the type you have in Norway. But in Norway, you this bulge is so that could be now that it's kind of picking up. And I think, as you say, language has been a really big problem. I met only one Ukrainian who could speak English. For the other, we used a native Ukrainian as an interpreter. That I don't want to work, I'm not sure, but it can, of course, be discouraging that it's difficult to find work. The person who worked with me from Ukraine, she had been technically unemployed, although she is quite high skilled and educated, but language is a problem. So when she comes for the interview, her language skills are maybe not good enough for that job at the moment. And she's been working very hard on the language and have 18 months of language. So language seems to be the big thing. And that's when Norway has scaled down also, which is not good. So.
Do you want to add anything?
No, I just think that it's really important to keep the benefits, because in Finland that's the case, that also a lot of Ukrainians, especially families, and especially if they are also the grandparents, because there's also lots of women like grandmothers who are working then, who have arrived and who are working doing voluntary work, but also taking care of the kids. But so there are families with three generations. Then a lot of the women then do this informal work, or accept like also cleaning work, and very kind of, so they're not only underclass but also increasing the informal labor. So in the sense that I would, but that's the Finnish also level of so non-EU migrants. Just the reception allowance is so low that it's impossible almost impossible to live with it. And it has been now lowered by our current government, which is interesting, because at the same time they are very pro-Ukrainian, but because it's non-EU migrants and they are thinking about also the racialized groups, they are happy to lower the reception allowance even more. So it's crazy.
There's this race to the bottom that we see in many European countries. Okay, our time is up. I would like to thank the audience who are here, the audience with us online. I'd like to thank Camille, Lena, and Ava for sharing their ongoing projects and research. Thank you so much.
Thank you.